Hello, everyone. I'm Sian Heck, and I would like to present a model for my mesh case study project. Before we get into the model's explanation, let's overview my project thus far. My case study project focuses on improving the conditions of urban lower income ULI communities surrounding North Carolina A&T. I plan to achieve this by adopting sustainable food practices in these communities. I believe that poor food options, food swamps, the lack of access to quality foods, food deserts, and food literacy play a significant role in these communities' health, affecting community resilience. So, as I explore sustainable options to improve UI conditions, the built and natural environment are considered. And you will find in my model the thought process one might take when considering these factors alongside planetary health. I name my model Reflective Pyramid Diagram, or RPD for short. I emphasize the reflective portion because it shows how the basis of one thought process could be mirrored if viewed through a different, in this case, knowledgeable or non knowledgeable lens. Whole system thinking allows critical assessment to guide one's thought process when considering planetary health. This means one must explore how to improve planetary health given various levels of knowledge. As for me, the RPD model assists me in rationalizing how and when to incorporate sustainable food practices in ULI communities. Let's take a closer look at the RPD to understand the two thought processes. We'll begin here. When approaching the problem from a non knowledgeable standpoint, we first recognize there's an issue within the community. Something isn't right. Secondly, we acknowledge the problem. There are disparities within these communities' social infrastructures. So, when looking at it from a non knowledgeable standpoint, we're able to recognize social disparities like education and health. After accepting acknowledgement, we act by examining health, in this case through a food lens. While exploring health solutions, we find that sustainable food practices can be incorporated. By incorporating sustainable food practices, we come across our first result, the building of resilient communities. As a result of building resilient communities, the natural ecosystem is repaired. Finally, the end result of improving conditions of UI communities improves planetary health. So we find improvements to the Earth and its organisms' health. The reflected pyramid above represents approaching planetary health from a knowledgeable perspective. In this approach, we begin with understanding planetary health and have identified a problem with achieving it. So, we acknowledge that the natural environment must be regenerated to achieve planetary health. The results of this acknowledgement brings us to the question of how we regenerate natural ecosystems. To restore ecosystems, we need to build resilient communities. Result 2 on this diagram encourages us to adopt sustainable food practices. Sustainable food practices are a solution to building resilience. Here's where the action takes place. We must understand what sustainable food practices are needed. So, we examine health through a food lens. After we identify there's a problem with health caused by food, we must develop social infrastructures, educational and health facilities. Finally, we ask ourselves, where should these social infrastructures be placed to improve planetary health? We find that by placing social infrastructures in ULI communities, benefits to ULI communities and planetary health would improve. Here's a recap of the RPD. The base model approaches the problem from a non knowledgeable perspective. It begins with identifying the issue of poor community conditions. As one works up the diagram, they find improvements to planetary health. The reflected pyramid above represents the approach to the problem of planetary health from a knowledgeable perspective. It begins with identifying the problem with achieving planetary health. As they move up the diagram, they find there needs to be an improvement in UI conditions to achieve planetary health. I like this representation of my case study because I find that where one problem begins, the solution to that problem is solved by the other's starting point, and vice versa. So, think of this diagram as a book. As the book folds, each problem is overlapped, and so forth. Note here, I presented the RPD in a 2D format, which is functional, but this diagram should be represented in 3D. A 3D representation will give you an understanding of how these problems, actions, and results stack up on top of one another, which is essential to building the foundation of a clear thought process. How does this model influence my project? 1. It helps me identify where I need to make changes within my project. I found that I need to rework my approach to incorporating sustainable food practices in ULI communities. In particular, within my solutions, I must focus on building resilient communities that would improve ULI conditions and planetary health. 2. The RPD helps me identify what changes I need to add to my case study. Again, as I walk through the model, my thought process helps me map out the factors influencing my ultimate goal. For example, I must acknowledge the disparities in social infrastructures to improve ULI conditions. This leads me to examine the health of the community. Prior to the model's construction, my project didn't particularly focus on the determinants of health. Finally, the RPD influences how I approach my project. I now understand that my approach to sustainable food practices isn't linear but consists of multiple factors that influence one another, and sometimes these factors overlap. The RPD will help me reconsider my approach to ULI community disparities by making my thought process more transparent. Overall, it's important to frame our case studies around a visual representation because it helps us organize our thoughts for a practical application. Also, it allows us to expand our case studies to visual learners, which is said to be more effective than other teaching methods. I hope that by presenting the reflective pyramid diagram to you all, the methodical process of my case study will be more transparent. Here's a quick summary of the key points learned within ESH 502 and how they apply to our case study project. Week 1. First, we defined health. We quickly learned that defining health isn't as simple as it may seem. When viewing health through a global lens, cultural significance should be accounted for. We use complex adaptive systems (CAS) as a preferred assessment method because it allows for changing factors. CAS does not follow a linear path, but accounts for complexity, which is a great way to construct our project's model. Week 2. Week 2 was essential for setting the stage for health in the built environment. We learned how to define, classify, and identify the determinants of diseases. There are two classifications of diseases: communicable, infectious, and non communicable, non infectious diseases. We use disease classification to hypothesize what factors influence our case study problem statement. The epitriad is introduced to help us clearly define the factors. We use the epitriad as a practical example for our case study model. Week 3. Like week 2, week 3 offered us a foundational building of health in the built environment. In this week, we learned how the built environment governs planetary health. Also, we learned how to classify the built environment versus the natural environment. Again, classification is vital in defining our project's complex system. Weeks 4 and 5. In these weeks, we explore the UN Sustainability Development Goals for 2030. We quickly realized that majority of these goals are unrealistic and will take much longer to achieve. The problem we found with these goals are that they are too grand and too vague, which leaves room for ambiguity. After investigating and reflecting on the SDG goals, we found that we must resize our projects to be more effective. Weeks 6 and 7. Winding down ESH 502, we learned in weeks 6 and 7 that while some of our solutions to planetary health are complex, the simplest solutions are in nature. Nature based solutions are our greatest weapon in fighting environmental degradation. Nature based solutions also build resilience within the community. We find that we can incorporate nature based solutions in disaster mitigation, or we can use these solutions as a tool of equity. These solutions can bridge the gap between the global north and south. The most significant takeaway from week 6 and 7 is the discovery of nature based solutions, which will benefit our case study projects. Thank you for tuning in to this presentation.